At Just Climate, we are a global investor, so we invest both in North America and Europe. And we certainly see that the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, to have really kind of bolstered the ventures ecosystem and the startup ecosystem in the US. So we see some of the incentives like the 45Q or the incentives around electric vehicles to really accelerate the deployment of business models and companies in that market. I think we would like to see more of that in Europe. Unfortunately, the legislation that we're seeing being enacted today are not as directive as to provide the subsidies or the taxes to hard-to-abate sectors or subsidies to companies that are implementing climate-aligned business models and technologies. So we would like to certainly see more of that, to see an equivalent response, I would say, from EU legislators. I think one of the drivers that we see in Europe that's accelerating green technologies is the cross-border adjustment mechanism, which aims to tax heavy industries in Europe. So we see that obviously in the steel investment that I mentioned, but also we'll have to see heavy emitters start to transition the operations towards greener technologies.
Europe, while it's more a little bit of a stick policy, you need to do this, which it's not as incentivized in the US. That is a carrot. Here you have $3 per kilo of hydrogen and go build it. In general, we like the structure of the European carbon tax scheme as a more permanent way and as a way, I would say, the world should work, where if you emit, you pay, and you find the cheapest way to decarbonize yourself, and you then make a business case for each situation. We think that's more efficient from a tax perspective. But then from a subsidy and trying to get things moving forward and trying to get the companies to go through the learning curve to get the cost down, the IRA and what the US is doing it's clearly has a much bigger impact. So I think Europe is now reacting a little bit to IRA. IRA is creating a flux of entrepreneurs that everybody wants to put their first plant, the first manufacturing facility. Anything you want to do in energy transition, it's today a little bit easier to get government support in the US. And the Europe, is trying to respond. Ultimately, the challenge that we see is that hydrogen, it's a variable cost-driven product. When those incentives disappear, there's going to be a lot of assets that are going to be a little bit in positions that could become stranded because it made sense while someone would give you $3. When that's gone, you still got to pay 50 kilowatt hours per kilo. So it's a lot of energy. So we'll see. We think that now to go through the learning curve is very effective. Then whether those assets are effectively built in areas that make sense and can sustain themselves without a government subsidy, it's yet to be seen. So there's two sides of the coin.
Hydrogen is essential for decarbonising industry. And certain other things. Potentially it's going to have a role in aviation and shipping. It's expensive to make today, so policymakers are trying to work out how do we reduce its costs, first up, and stimulate demand. Because although hydrogen is a big sector today, it's used in two things really: fertilizer, ammonia-based fertilizer, and oil refining. So if we're going to stimulate its use in shipping and steel making and petrochemicals, we need new sectors to start buying it, otherwise wouldn't have bought it. And we need people who are willing to pay a premium. Today, the premium is significant. That will shrink the gap between grey and green hydrogen. But the idea of policymakers is, how can we make that gap shrink faster? So, as you said, in the US, the idea is let's subsidize the production cost. The idea of if we build it, they will come. If we make hydrogen as green hydrogen, as cheap as grey, we're going to find loads of off-takers. Now, that's a problem. I don't think that's actually the solution, because many people who would need to buy hydrogen to go net zero also have to invest a lot of capital to use that hydrogen. You need brand new steel technology, brand new shipping technology to buy that hydrogen, even if it's cheap. And a lot of industries aren't incentivized to go green anyway. In Europe, what they're doing is mandating the use of green hydrogen in certain sectors and employing a carbon price, which is their way of closing the price gap. It's just rather than subsidizing it from taxpayer money. They're forcing corporates to pay that tax. Now, there's pros and cons on both sides. Ideally, we want both carrots and sticks. The way that Europe is going about this is defining green hydrogen very specifically. I think this is really, really important. I do not think it is a problem saying it has to be powered renewably. You have to prove that it's hourly matching. It has to be additional renewables that are actually being built to power the hydrogen. This is all really important. We don't want hydrogen just for the sake of hydrogen. We want it because it can decarbonize sectors. There's no point incentivizing more grey hydrogen production. And there's no point incentivizing green hydrogen production that isn't actually green, or is stealing renewable capacity from the grid that would otherwise go to decarbonizing our homes or our cars. Will it slow the development? I'm not sure that's true. I think the European Union has done a very good job of laying out clearly in the last 2 decades where it wants to go. It wants to build more renewables. It sets a target. It sets a mandate. It gives out money. And the certainty of the policy is what stimulates investment. Investors want certainty. The European Union has laid out very clearly what its rules are for green hydrogen. They make sense to us. They might make it a bit more expensive, and it might make projects a bit harder to get financed or to situate themselves. But the thing they'll be producing is what we need, which is net zero fuel. The US debate, as I think you know, there's a huge amount of lobby money going into making sure the US government doesn't adopt similar European Union rules. We think it's a huge mistake. If you're making hydrogen from grid electricity, it is 2 or 3 times more dirty than just making hydrogen from natural gas. So you're actually making the problem worse. You're increasing climate change by making grid-based hydrogen. So in the US, because the grid's so dirty in America, so in the US, to bother at all with incentivizing green hydrogen, you need to prove it's actually made from renewable power. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. So I think our view is very, very pro what the European Union has been up to.
Our fund is globally focused, and we see that there is great opportunity, and we invest today primarily in North America and Europe. And the reason is a lot of the innovation is coming out of that. In Europe, very specifically, there is more IP filed in Europe than in the US. So I think the technology development is very strong. The ecosystem on technology development is very strong. And as we talked a lot about at Energy Week, mandates in Europe are more common than incentives. So mandates, but also public monies. And those two combined are actually really quite interesting. There are big, bold targets, and there are carbon tariffs and penalties, as well as a lot of public monies for companies. So I think that's going to be a really nice opportunity for certain areas to develop. That being said, Europe's ahead on certain things, Europe's behind on certain things. So a little bit of an example, heat pump deployment, electrification of EVs. Look at the Nordics, the EV adoption is in the 80s and 90%. The heat pump adoption's in the millions here. It's just starting to be a term in the US, right? That being said, smart meters are not widely deployed in Europe and very disparately across each country. And that's a big challenge, right? If you're talking about smart home and wanting to manage distributed energy resources and having a smart thermostat, it's still really hard to adopt that because smart meters don't even exist here, right? So, versus the deployment in the US of smart meters is in the 20 millions, right? So it's interesting because each ecosystem has their pros and cons.
I would say probably we need a bit of both, right? So I think one of the things we note is that the urgency of climate issue, and we have a concept, that we talk about at Just Climate called the time value of carbon, right? So ability to remove carbon out of the atmosphere today is really, really important. So to incentivize companies to do so through subsidies and benefits, certainly enables them to act on that in an immediate fashion. But I think in the long term, you do need legislations to come in to try to get the industry to be aligned with that pathway because otherwise we may take too long to get there in terms of decarbonizing the heavy emitters. So I think you need a bit of both.
It's a group of many different countries with different cultures and different languages and different ways they think about recycling, ways they think about energy, ways they think about like distributing the grid. How green is their grid, right? So each country has a unique profile. And so it's a little bit more complicated to scale within Europe. I think the opportunity is the European founders are different. And I think I come from an American background with a US investment, typically investing in US companies. And so I understand US companies and entrepreneurs love to talk about the vision. And they raise a lot of money and they have big valuation and you double or triple every time you raise and you go big. Go big or go home, right? Michael Liebrich was talking a little bit about that. And that's really true. I think the European ecosystem, and German entrepreneurs are my favorite. They have a plan and they stick to the plan and they deliver to the plan and they raise and they deliver and they raise and they deliver, and it's very execution and it's very like linear. And you don't see this sort of hockey stick growth, but then they actually are very disciplined about the capital deployment. So the question is who wins, right? So very often you see exits in Europe being a large US company with a lot of funds who wants to come to Europe and access that, finds a European company and buys them. So an example is like GetAround. GetAround is a ride-sharing company in the US based out of San Francisco. They raised a lot of money. They had about 1,000 vehicles in their fleet. And there was a company here called Drivey. Drivey was based in France. They had a lot more, I think in the 10,000 number of vehicles on their fleet all across, but their utilization wasn't as high. Instead of GetAround coming to Europe and trying to grow, they decided to buy Drivey and then take their application of the high utilization model and apply it to the large fleet, which I think was a really clever way of thinking about it. So it's good for us from an investor perspective because we see like a natural exit for that, US, European kind of difference in entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's the problem with Europe in general is that we have the European market, but then the specifics of each individual countries are still pretty fragmented. So we have a few investments in Germany, a few investments in France, couple of things in Italy, and every time it's really the pain of going on a case-by-case basis and trying to figure out where the specifics of not even the single country, but a single university, because there are universities that have set up TTOs earlier and historically, and universities just recently did it. And in that case, it's just a conversation. It becomes so granular, and that's in a sense the frustrating part. But it's I think the ecosystem as a whole needs another 5 to 10 years to get to a point of homogeneity where you can more confidently invest.